In late July 1943, I was commanding the assault reserve of the regiment in the Maluksa position. One afternoon I was requested to report to the command post, where it was explained to me that a soldier condemned to death was to be executed by firing squad. Having received the appalling assignment to carry out the execution, I requested from the battalion adjutant the details regarding the case. If I was to be responsible for the death of one of our own, to ease my own conscience, I desired to know why such a severe penalty had been imposed on the soldier. It was explained to me that a member of the 5th Company had observed a soldier steal a package from the postal transport en route to the platoon, from which he removed cigarettes and food for his own use. It was widely known throughout our ranks that a theft of this nature constituted a serious crime in the German army, for which a severe punishment could be imposed. Later, while standing alone on sentry duty with the perpetrator, the soldier who had witnessed the theft informed the culprit that he had seen the incident and that he should immediately return the stolen goods, or that all details of the theft would be reported. The thief, obviously fearing the repercussions of his crime should it be made known, quickly sprang to the machine gun, pivoted the gun on its lafette, and shot the witness with a full burst from the automatic weapon at close range. He then tossed several hand grenades, which were always primed and within an arm's reach of the machine gun, and feigned an engagement of Russian reconnaissance troops before the position. The wounded soldier did not die immediately, but was taken to the medical station with severe chest and abdominal wounds, which shortly proved to be fatal. He temporarily regained consciousness, however, and was able to report the incident to the medical officer. The murderer was arrested and a summary court-martial was convened. Subsequently, the perpetrator was sentenced to die by firing squad. There was no shortage of volunteers to serve for this purpose, and a platoon from the victim's company provided the necessary number of riflemen to carry out the sentence. The following morning I began making the meticulous preparations for the execution. From the regimental headquarters I received the precise official details of how it was to be conducted. Army regulations required that a 2-metre stake be anchored vertically in the ground, supported from the rear. If possible, a retaining wall was to be located a short distance behind the stake for the purpose of stopping the bullets. Not far from the regimental headquarters, I constructed a small sandy berm, against which a low retaining wall was built. The firing squad quietly assembled, accompanied by a Feldwebel with a Luger pistol in his right hand. In the event the condemned did not die immediately, he would be required to fire the killing shot. As prescribed in the regulations, a medical officer was present. I quietly briefed the firing squad on how the procedure was to be conducted. As I spoke, I scanned the faces of the soldiers who were to squeeze the triggers for any sign of nervousness or hesitation. The soldiers followed my orders and stood silently in ranks at their prescribed location, rifles at rest. The execution was ordered to be carried through at exactly 15 o'clock. Several minutes prior to the time specified, the regimental legal officer arrived with a number of field police. Stumbling unsteadily among them was the condemned, who, with an ashen face, was still clad in our field grey uniform, stripped of rank and all insignia. Without hesitation, several of the field police escorted the condemned forward, where he was quickly bound to the stake with his hands tied behind his back at the wrists. Wordlessly, a blindfold was placed over his eyes and tied securely behind his head. The escort then distanced themselves from the condemned, and the division chaplain stepped forward and spoke softly to him. The silence lay heavy in the air. The condemned appeared to strain against the cords binding him to the stake. His head dropped upon his breast as the chaplain whispered words unheard by the firing squad. From several kilometres distance on the front, the customary shell bursts and isolated rifle shots floated softly over the open ground to reach our ears. Despite the unquestionable guilt of the condemned and the necessity of carrying through our assignment, emotions remained mixed when we were faced with the unthinkable task of shooting one of our own, of firing on the uniform worn so long by all present. Thoughts raced through my mind. I was fully aware that in another place and another time this man would most likely have lived a full and productive life, and that his life had been stolen from him, like millions of others, by the folly and temerity of those beyond our power. My thoughts went to his family, his mother, father, siblings. I asked myself if they would ever learn the true fate of their loved one, of how he met his end in Russia. The laws of the front were harsh and unforgiving, and in this case the sentence could only be considered as just. The execution squad remained in position opposite the bound soldier. I glanced about at those present, and I observed that all witnesses and participants had fixed their eyes upon the man to die. The firing squad exhibited grim, tired faces, void of emotion. The legal officer and the medical officer stood a short distance away, well beyond the line of fire, hands clasped behind their backs, faces expressionless. Only the Feldwebel, with pistol in hand, looked at me expectantly. I found myself looking at my watch. At exactly 15 o'clock, as if on the parade field, the commands came from my throat. Zur Salve hoch legt an gebt Feuer. With a roar, the rifle bullets tore through the breast of the condemned. He rocked back against the stake, blood erupting from the wounds. He collapsed against the cords as all strength and consciousness left his body and hung silently against the stake for several seconds. The medical officer strode forward to examine the still form. Despite the severity of the wounds, he detected a pulse and looked first at me, then shifted his glance to the Feldwebel to motion him forward. The Feldwebel stepped forward, raised his arm, and fired point-blank into the head of the condemned, just behind the ear. Again the medical officer approached, examined the now lifeless form, and called to the police escort. 2 men loosened the form from the stake. Others then stepped forward, and the body was laid in a wooden box. Without another word, they disappeared in a cloud of dust as they drove away. Having put that unforgettable experience into words, I must also state that this incident was the only such case that I experienced throughout the years on the Eastern Front. Never again was I even remotely aware of another incident of theft among the Lancers. In August 1943, our division relieved the 121st Infantry Division, which had suffered heavily during the fighting on the Neva along a 10-kilometre front. Since the 2nd of August, Grenadier Regiment 436 had come under command of the 5th Mountain Division, which had experienced numerous assaults by an enemy heavily reinforced with armour and had suffered high casualties. The days prior to the 132D Division's arrival on the line had remained relatively quiet. However, on the 11th of August, the enemy launched a major attack. Attacking in regimental strength against the Poretshe bridgehead, the Soviets succeeded in breaking through the thinly held line, but were later repulsed with heavy losses following our counterattack. A second assault launched in the evening was again beaten back with support from our heavy artillery. During the night, the troops prepared for follow-on fighting. While attempting to resupply the exhausted units, the Lancers came under constant bombing attacks as Soviet aircraft overflew the lines. Although the Ratas were lost to sight in the darkness, their droning would grow rapidly in intensity. Then they would bank and sweep over the positions, dropping loads of bombs and tearing the earth with bursts from their machine guns. On the 12th of August, at exactly 9 o'clock, the enemy launched an attack along the entire front in full strength. It consisted of numerous waves of brown-clad infantrymen, heavily supported by artillery fire, tanks, and overwhelming air power. These attacks in company, battalion, and regimental strength, which lasted an entire day, were beaten back either in brutal hand-to-hand fighting or with a combination of all available resources. Isolated penetrations were countered with assembled reserves. In the sector held by Grenadier Regiment 437, however, the enemy was successful in penetrating the forefront of the bridgehead and was able to enlarge the penetration to the south for a total of 300 metres. The counterattack by the reserves remained mired and ineffective in the face of massive fire support from enemy artillery and advancing tanks. During the night, 19 enemy tanks were destroyed in close combat. Feldwebel Rain of the 7th Company, Grenadier Regiment 436, distinguished himself by personally destroying 2 of the enemy tanks, then assumed leadership of the company after the commander was severely wounded. Leading the company against an overwhelming enemy, he beat back the Soviet attempts to sever the line and split the seam between the 2 regiments' sectors. His bravery and skill proved to be invaluable in preventing the regiments from being cut off and possibly annihilated. On the 13th of August at 4:30, the Russians again struck the line, and following an initial success in pushing back the German defenders, were unable to further penetrate the line held by the surviving Lancers. At 6 o'clock, we counterattacked against overwhelmingly superior enemy forces, supported by heavy artillery blocking fire, but were able to make little progress in restoring the line to our old positions. As our own attack ground to a halt, the enemy again struck with renewed strength, penetrating the defences with concentrated armour under heavy artillery support. As the battle pivoted back and forth through the shattered forests and swamps, the Soviets were able to break through to the south and occupy the area northeast of Poretche. Again, our regiment was thrown into the attack. In vicious fighting that lasted throughout the day, we finally succeeded in bringing the Soviet advance to a halt at 17 o'clock and recaptured the Poretche sector. After suffering numerous casualties, the Russians were stopped along the ridge marked as 54.1, approximately 200 metres south of Barskoye Lake. This effort required the use of the last reserves of men and material and was successful only after heavy fighting throughout the afternoon. The following day, the 2 Battalion, 1st Grenadier Regiment, Reconnaissance Battalion 132, Pionnier Battalion 132, and parts of the 3rd Battalion, Grenadier Regiment 437, were pulled out of the line. Immediately reorganised into Group Schmidt, they were thrust back into action to recapture the sections of the main battle line along an area referred to in the reports as the Sandkaula. Despite heavy blocking fire from Soviet batteries, the attack won ground, and the units assigned to the left and right wings soon reached their objectives. The Russians counterattacked with massive airstrikes, supported by artillery bombardments and concentrated armoured units. Despite its initial successes, it was deemed necessary to withdraw Group Schmidt in the face of overwhelming opposition, leaving the Sandkaula heights to the enemy. In the afternoon, the enemy responded to the withdrawal of Group Schmidt with another assault. Despite the constant action experienced by the group throughout the day, they were successful in repelling the enemy strike and were able to push the Soviet forces back. During the fighting, the group remained under almost constant attack from enemy fighter bombers that dropped anti-personnel bombs and fired into the attacking Lancers with board weapons. The evening saw the main battle line still in our hands, although the Soviet forces had paid heavily in their attempts to break through and encircle our beleaguered units. The enemy used the night to reassemble his forces. Sounds of activity reverberated through the forests as the whine of Ford engines, accompanied by the rumble of T-34 tanks, was heard moving forward through the Soviet positions. The Lancers resupplied their ammunition, bandaged the wounded, sent the severely wounded to the rear, and waited expectantly for what they instinctively sensed the following day would bring. In the early morning hours, silence fell on the vast expanse of forest. Exhausted soldiers lay behind makeshift barricades or crouched in hastily dug foxholes and attempted to sleep. In the grey light of dawn, the snipers crawled forward and searched the ghastly landscape through rifle scopes for any hint of movement. With trained eyes pressed to the rubber ring shielding their optics, they slowly swept their field of fire from left to right to left, methodically following a mental grid, leaving no twig, no splintered tree, no parcel of torn earth unseen before them. On this morning, the snipers' rifles remained silent. No enemy reconnaissance troops ventured forth. No sentries were placed. No Soviet snipers came forward to oppose ours in deadly duels. For the troops waiting behind the barricades, the silence that had descended upon the line remained a mixed, possibly ominous signal. The Russians were not digging in. The sun had climbed above the treetops when, at 9 o'clock, the aircraft swept down on our positions. Bombs burst among the hidden ranks of defenders, followed by the sharp crack of mortar rounds exploding on preset targets. The Lancers wormed their way deeper into the protection of the barricades, pressed themselves against the earth, and waited for the barrage to lift. After long minutes, the explosions subsided and the attack was launched. The grey-green figures sprang from the recesses of their foxholes, grasped machine guns and carbines, prepared the priming cords and stacked their supplies of hand grenades, and met the assault. With massed waves of infantry, the Soviets broke through the thinly held line in two sectors. Attempting a giant pincer movement, they thrust forward toward Schlossberg, Baracken, and the Jewish cemetery. Despite the artillery barrages and fighter-bomber attacks, the Lancers were successful in halting the advance. The 2nd Company, Grenadier Regiment 437, distinguished itself in repelling this enemy assault, which had penetrated into the Narsia sector to the west of Geisterwaldchen and was attempting to strike to the south. Nevertheless, we saw that it was now necessary to withdraw our forces from the Sandkauler heights. During the night of 14–15 of August, the Lancers were withdrawn and hastily used to augment the Field Replacement Battalion. With this move, it became apparent that the Poretsche bridgehead was to be evacuated to avoid encirclement of the forces still holding their positions on the line. During the night of 15–16 of August, the withdrawal was put into motion, and the positions were abandoned, save a 100-metre wide section east of the Nasia. The evacuation was completed by 2:30. With this withdrawal to terrain that offered better defences, the threat of breakthrough was temporarily halted, despite our having surrendered ground. The main battle line remained unbroken throughout the sector held by the division, and the numerous attempts by the Soviets to penetrate the defences ground to a halt. In preparation for withdrawing the 132d Infantry Division from the line, the 1st Infantry Division relieved the badly mauled Grenadier Regiment 437 in the early morning hours of the 16th of August. The 132d Infantry Division began withdrawing from the positions that evening, having been officially relieved on the line by the 254th Infantry Division. Reduced by casualties and exhausted to the point of incoherence, the Grenadiers had successfully defended the line through almost 7 days and nights of uninterrupted combat against overwhelming odds. With this final withdrawal, the participation of the 132d Infantry Division in the Poretsche bridgehead drew to a close. During the course of this battle, the enemy had thrust these divisions and armoured units into the battle. 364th Rifle Division, with parts of 3 regiments, 374th Rifle Division, with 2 regiments, 165th Rifle Division, with 2 regiments, 378th Rifle Division, with 2 regiments, 311th Rifle Division, with 1 regiment, 256th Rifle Division, with 1 regiment, 503d Armoured Battalion, with 14 tanks, 35th Armoured Regiment, with 15 tanks, 50th Armoured Regiment, with 15 tanks, 77th Independent Engineer Battalion. 12 to 14 enemy battalions were reported as decimated. 24 tanks were destroyed, 10 of which were knocked out in close combat with light weapons. The Russians had suffered extremely high casualties during the intensive Soviet attempts to break the defence line. With the withdrawal of our division, the battle south of Lake Ladoga came to an end. At 8 o'clock, the 18th of August, General Lindemann turned over command of the 132d Infantry Division to his replacement, General Major Wagner. Simultaneously, the sector held by that division was officially turned over to the 254th Infantry Division. General Lindemann wrote a letter of departure to his division. 132nd Infantry Division, soldiers of the 132nd Infantry Division. Called to other duties and responsibilities, I have today relinquished command of the division, which I have had the honour to lead since the 5th of January 1942. I reflect back upon this period of time with immense pride and satisfaction. In every battle, in each engagement, we remained victorious. In attack, we defeated the enemy forces, often to their total destruction. In defence, we remained the lords of the battlefield, never having once lost an artillery piece to the enemy. Welded together into 6 battalions following the battle for Sevastopol, the divisions struck the enemy again in January 1942, and fighting through ice and snow, through mud and rain, defeated the enemy during the winter battle of Feodosia and pushed them to the sea. After many victories during the defensive battles from February to April 1942 in the area of Daln-Kamishi, the division broke through the line on the Parpach position on the 8th of May and thrust rapidly ahead from Kamish Burun to the harbour of Kerch, where we witnessed the last enemy transports fleeing before us. On the 7th of June, 1942, the division was transferred to the north front of Sevastopol to assault the Oelberg. The Neuhaus Heights were taken while fighting fiercely under the most adverse of conditions. With the assault on the bastion, the armoured battery Maxim Gorky, considered the most modern and strongly defended battery that existed at that time, and the capture of Fort Shishkova, the entire northern fortress system fell to our forces. After our push through to the battery tongue on the north edge of the harbour, the division struck toward the west over the Tchernaya, and on the 1st of July captured the city with an unparalleled and daring sweep from the south. With this success, the special report was issued announcing the fall of the mighty fortress. The division was then transferred to northern Russia, where the brave regiments immediately engaged 7 Soviet divisions in brutal combat throughout September 1942 in the swamps and forests of the Gaitolovo pocket. During this phase of bloody fighting, all breakthrough attempts by the Soviets were successfully repelled. In the defensive Battle of Smyrdinia in February 1943, an overwhelming force of 5 Russian divisions, 2 armoured brigades, and 2 rifle brigades collapsed against the iron defences of the division. The enemy losses exceeded 75 tanks due to the steadfast defence exhibited by the brave men of the division while facing an overwhelming enemy. During the last days of my command, the division successfully repelled all attempts by the enemy to break the main defence line during the third battle south of Lake Ladoga. Despite the heavy artillery and mortar bombardments, despite the endless attacks by enemy aircraft which occurred day and night, the brave men of all the division's units successfully repelled every enemy attack, inflicting grave losses upon an overwhelming enemy force. Whenever called upon, the junior officers and non-commissioned officers successfully met every challenge, repelling and often totally destroying the enemy forces opposing them. The iron curtain of protection provided by our artillery units never failed us in the heat of battle, and through their skill and professional abilities, they were able to repel the most aggressive foe, to include armoured units. The enemy forces were often demoralised or destroyed by our artillery prior to coming within range of our infantry weapons, thus sparing our infantry numerous casualties that otherwise would have been inflicted without this support. Our anti-tank units, through skillful use of various weapons, were successful in the destruction of 24 enemy tanks, of which 7 fell to the infantry in close combat. This feat deserves my special recognition. Also in these instances, the victory in defence lay with us, soldiers. On the march through the waterless steppes of southern Russia, during the fighting in the ice-covered or burning heights of Sevastopol, or upon the plains of the Kerch Peninsula, in the mud and swamps of Gaitolovo, through the hip-deep snow of Smyrdinia and in the pock-marked terrain south of Lake Ladoga and the Nasia, you have accomplished the seemingly impossible. My unending gratitude and my special recognition goes out to my exemplary commanders, whose names shall be eternally recognized in the history of the division, as well as to the officers and non-commissioned officers, the independent fighters who held steadfast against all odds, and whose countless deeds often remained unwitnessed and unspoken, but were of decisive importance to our survival and to our subsequent victories. I thank all branches of service for your endurance and your selfless comradeship. I now take leave of a division that has been welded together through the heat of battle experienced in the expanses of Russia, and my thoughts remain with our 4,520 dead, who sleep their eternal rest on the banks of the Dnieper, on the battlefields of the Crimea, and in the contested forests to the south of Lake Ladoga. I know that the closing words I once issued with my very first daily order as new division commander, "Trust for the trustworthy," have been echoed many times. I depart from my old division with the unbreakable bonds of comradeship and unity of spirit. I wish the division, and each and every member, the very best soldier's luck, and I close with the recognition. August 1943. Nasia Grund, St. Kaula, Jewish Cemetery, Geisterwald, Poreche, Voronovo. Those are the names of insignificant battlefields that remained burned into the memories of those who survived. Sweeping back and forth, the deadly contests raged for days, weeks, and months throughout the forests and swamps near Leningrad. This was a killing ground where many thousands of men and machines were pitted against one another. The soldiers killed without remorse or mercy over hotly contested, jagged terrain. Small road crossings were defended to the last bullet. A small rise in the swampy terrain would suddenly gain importance and become a citadel where the combatants fought bitterly to the end. In this tangled jungle, uncounted brave souls died and were lost forever in unmarked graves. At one time there was a dense green forest with thick undergrowth and majestic pines. The air was filled with the singing of birds from the lush undergrowth and from high in the tops of the stands of birch and alder trees. Then came the armies. The earth was torn and overturned by an endless hail of bombs and artillery shells. The fresh green of the forest no longer dared show itself, lest it be destroyed again. Nature turned its face in anguish from the scene of grenade and bomb craters, of thick tree trunks splintered from machine gun bursts, of expanses of woods set alight by tracer bullets, leaving only blackened posts through which men dashed headlong into battle, straining beneath loads of war material carbines and submachine guns, linen sacks filled with the deadly weight of hand grenades, steel grey-green canisters of belted machine gun ammunition, anti-tank weapons and mines. In desperation, they dodged the shell bursts and sought the very shelter they had stripped from the earth. Ragged limbs of dying trees pointed agonizingly toward the heavens, void of all growth and life in this man-made hell. Through skies clouded with the smoke and dust of battle, the sun appeared only as an orange glow as it tried to penetrate air choked with debris. There was once a stream, crystal clear, winding its way through this land to join the river Volchov, eventually meeting Lake Ladoga. In previous years, the intelligentsia and wealthy visitors from Petersburg would come to enjoy the lush forest canopies, to escape the heat and oppression of August in the city. Now the Nassia's land was crushed and torn, the once clear-running stream choked and muddy, tormented and poisoned by the dead lying thick in the forests, the ugly debris of war. The green meadows, fed by clear water, were now muddy swamps, churned and spoiled by the evil that had befallen this place. The crisp air was heavy and putrid with the stench of dead soldiers and horses, grotesquely swollen in the summer heat. There was once a village, marked by picturesque wooden cottages and houses with slate roofs sporting a layer of soft moss. The windows were framed with carefully fitted shutters and window panes, finely carved with stylized Russian ornamentation cut long ago. The houses typically had sported a covered entrance lined with benches. Here would sit Gregor and Ivan with Dunya and Tamara in the evenings, smoking papyrossi and gazing at the evening sky, the same sky described so well by Nikolai Gogol in Dead Souls. Then came the soldiers. First, the dwelling was destroyed, with only an ugly black mound remaining, the chimney rising awkwardly and painfully from the ashes. An explosive projectile fired from a distant Russian gun soon brought the chimney and oven crashing to earth, adding the rubble of burnt brick and mortar to the blackened ruins. The ruins were then occupied by a half-dozen lancers. They hastily removed the entrenching tools from their belts and hacked at the earth, burrowing deep beneath the blackened timbers and ashes. They then stacked the bricks from the destroyed chimney and carried bits of shattered tree trunks to reinforce their position. With the skill and expertise learned from many previous battles, they constructed their fortress facing the east and created gun positions from the ruins. When their afternoon of labour met their satisfaction, they carefully positioned their machine gun and readied hand grenades by removing the safety cap from the base of the wooden handles, then stacked them in a neat pyramid nearby. They opened cases of ammunition, inspected and loaded flare pistols. They then waited for the darkness, when they would face the next attack. During the night, the darkness was suddenly shattered by explosions. Muzzle flashes illuminated the positions of ghost-like figures moving rapidly through the wooded glade. The Lancers grasped hand grenades and crouched behind their machine gun, with hearts pounding and terror gripping their limbs. Suddenly, Russian submachine gun bullets snapped and whistled over their helmets. In one motion, the machine gun crew pulled the primer cords from their grenades, lobbed them into the darkness, and waited expectantly. The blasts of the grenades swept over the tiny cluster of figures, accompanied by the screaming of a wounded Russian. Grasping the machine gun, the crew leader fired a ripping burst into the darkness. The others joined in with carbines and submachine guns. The screams grew faint, and the terrifying sound of bodies crashing through the undergrowth was heard as the enemy patrol retreated. In the ghostly light of magnesium flares, the silhouettes of the attackers faded into darkness. The probe was momentarily repulsed. The grenadiers crouched in their holes and prepared for the next onslaught, and over the broken terrain drifted the unmistakable, throbbing sound of engines. Tanks were coming. The German artillery batteries began firing salvos over the ruins into the enemy positions. The explosions of heavy-caliber shells drowned the whine of engines and the grinding of the heavy steel tracks. The Russian armour slowed, then hesitated and waited. With dawn came a barrage crashing from the barrels of more than 1,000 enemy guns. The Russians commanded the skies, and Soviet aircraft dropped anti-personnel bombs and strafed the German positions with machine guns and cannon. The Lancers pressed themselves tightly against the earth. Huge chunks of brick and stone flew through the air. The dirt walls of the positions collapsed on the heavy field grey helmets of the grenadiers. The earth shook and trembled in agony. A soldier pulled his helmet over his face in a vain attempt to end the nightmare to hear nothing, see nothing, feel nothing. At this moment, gunloader Gregor Bogatkin of the Soviet Baltic Front slammed another 152mm projectile into the already hot breech of his howitzer. The attack was launched by the 364th Guards Division and 35th Armoured Regiment. The projectile screamed through the air, slammed into the earth and exploded, burying 4 cowering soldiers in field grey beneath earth and debris. Only a crater remained where the 4 had crouched in their position. From the earth protruded a single hand, half-opened gold wedding ring gleaming lightly. As the barrage of artillery fire and salvos of rockets crept forward, the 2 remaining survivors of the 6-man crew who had burrowed deep into the ruins caught their breath and began to move. They found themselves lying on their MG, half buried in sand and stones. Their tiny earthwork had collapsed beneath the pounding barrage. Through the forest they clearly detected the ominous familiar sound of rumbling engines. The Russians were coming, with tanks, T-34, accompanied by infantry. The dim silhouettes broke forth into the clearing from the forest's edge. The 2 attempted to fire their MG, the same weapon that had so faithfully protected them in battles past. Instead of the rapid, ripping burst so characteristic of the German automatic weapons, only one isolated shot left the barrel, then silence a jammed feed tray. The sensitive feeding mechanism was choked with sand from the shell bursts. The gun leader spun the gun about, and both men frantically attempted to work the bolt free. Bracing their weight against the weapon, they desperately attempted to clear the chamber and force the charging handle to the rear with their heavy infantry boots. The mechanism remained frozen in place. The clatter of the tracks grew louder as the enemy neared. The hurrah of the attacking infantry approached ever closer. One of the lancers sprang to his feet and dashed toward the other position to locate another weapon, but there he found only an empty crater, at the edge of which a lone hand was projecting from the earth. At this moment, Gunner Sergeant Ivan Chernikov, in the lead tank of the 35th Soviet Mechanized Brigade, squeezed the trigger of his 76mm cannon. The shell ripped through both of the German's legs below the knees. With a scream, the grenadier slammed to the earth and cried for help. No one heard the screams, and he crawled toward the rear, dragging the stumps of his legs behind him. The tank reached the now defenceless position. 2 stick grenades exploded harmlessly beneath the heavy tracks. The tank rolled over the MG nest, paused, and with rumbling engines it turned on its tracks, crushing the whole, burying from sight all traces of the desperately defended position. The T-34 rocked forward and pushed on through the German line, until it too met its destiny. An 88mm projectile from a hidden tiger lying in wait beneath heavy branches and foliage ripped through the turret of the Russian tank, tearing it from the chassis, and the massive vehicle began to burn. The forest reverberated with the angry sound of small arms fire, which slowly subsided. Another attack had been stopped. The 1st Battalion was no longer reporting. Shells rained on the headquarters and buried the battalion commander, Hauptmann Gussel, and the adjutant, Lieutenant Vogel, together with their staff. The communications equipment was smashed, the radio men were dead. Scores of wounded staggered or crawled toward the rear, or were carried in shelter quarters by Lancers, stumbling through a hail of artillery and Katyusha fire, toward the regimental aid station. Hurriedly, I briefed the small remaining group of Lancers, and prepared to launch a counterattack with the regimental reserve, which now consisted solely of a combined infantry pioneer platoon. Moving rapidly through the deafening din of battle, we dashed from shell crater to shell crater, battling with submachine guns and hand grenades until we reached the Sankaula. There we took a number of benumbed Russians prisoner, many of whom were wounded and unable to retreat. The night brought no rest. Flares sizzled across the sky and illuminated the tortured land in a silver light, showing the way for the Russian bombers to bring their loads of death. The Jewish cemetery was defended by a small group of Lancers led by Hauptmann Scheckenbach, and Russian assault troops infiltrated behind them. During the night, our couriers and ammunition supply carriers received sporadic fire from the darkness. I selected 2 groups of the old hares to take with me, names I had come to know well, men whom I knew would never falter: Kammermeier, Herr Fellner, Obermeier, Jockel, Mackelsdorfer, Mackinger, Feuerstein, Wagner, Ganser, Martin, Holtzmann, Kurtz, Dozer, Hack, Hipp, and others. We quickly prepared ourselves for action, stuffing our boots and belts with hand grenades and spare submachine gun magazines. 3 light machine guns were slung from the hip. Several canteens were passed through the tiny group at the last moment in a vain attempt to quench a nervous thirst. We plunged into the darkness and across a crater-strewn field, leaping from cover to cover, shooting into the trenches and holes, screaming and flinging hand grenades to our front, to the left and right. Furtive shadows in khaki brown darted before us, figures in olive-coloured round helmets with the small packs on their backs characteristic of the Soviet soldier. They scattered into the darkness like rabbits in the night, and we took 7 prisoners. The supply column followed our trail and located us at the Jewish cemetery. There we eagerly broke into the containers of food and ammunition, wordlessly devouring the meagre rations of cold wurst and bread. The battle raged for 7 days and nights. The regiments of the antagonists, bloodied and weary, refused to withdraw or stop to rest. To withdraw meant defeat. To halt for rest meant death. For the survivors of this hell, these swamps and forests, these jagged stumps and tortured earth, would remain as burning memories of the battle from which many would escape only through death. At long last, on the 16th of August, the bulk of the division was withdrawn from the battle line south of Lake Ladoga due to heavy losses. Regiment 437 remained on the line, and on the 17th of August, Oberstgraf Schwerin von Krosigk assumed command of the 1st East Prussian Infantry Division, while it still occupied the forward positions. During the night, Oberst Kindsmiller of my regiment proceeded forward to the 11th Company's headquarters. The unit was still clinging tenaciously to its positions in the Jewish cemetery. For 7 long days of fierce fighting, and under direct fire from armoured vehicles, barrages of artillery shells and tons of bombs dropped from endless waves of aircraft, Hauptmann Scheckenbach, nicknamed Stubborn Ferdinand, had refused to yield to the overwhelming attackers on the Jewish cemetery heights. Following a Soviet breakthrough in a left sector, his position became a strong point and was responsible for breaking waves of attacks, thus preventing a collapse of the entire left wing. Although Soviet infantry managed to infiltrate behind the position and entrench themselves firmly among the artillery and bomb craters, the 11th Company continued to hold. During the night, Hauptmann Scheckenbach summoned his runners. Gefreiter Fleck, the 19-year-old courier of the 2nd Platoon, crawled and raced through the torn landscape from his platoon position toward the company headquarters. Although the landscape had shifted and changed appearance constantly under incessant barrages, he instinctively found his way through the darkness. Throwing himself prone on the earth and lying motionless when sizzling flares would light up the sky, Fleck eventually arrived at the headquarters, gasping for breath and soaked with sweat. Slung over his shoulders and around his neck, he carried 4 Russian submachine guns he had gathered from enemy dead strewn across the moonscape terrain, as he had made his way across the contested ground. These weapons were particularly valued as trade items with rear-echelon logistics and supply personnel, and an experienced Lanza was never one to pass up such an opportunity. "Our only supply line has been cut by a Russian penetration," explained stubborn Ferdinand. The 5 couriers were given their assignment: get through the Soviet lines and return with enough food for 2 days. During this time, Oberst Keinsmiller had completed his briefing, and the 5 couriers were assigned to escort him back with them to regimental headquarters. The couriers carried 2 ration canisters per man, wearing one slung across the chest, the other strapped in a harness across the back. In addition to the German MP-40, or a captured Soviet PPSH submachine gun, they carried grenades stuck in their belts and in the tops of their boots. Thus burdened for their assignment, they plunged into the darkness, the Oberst between them in the centre of the file, carrying his stiffened left arm in the characteristic pose behind his back. Orientation became more difficult as the party slowly picked its way through the tortured landscape in the darkness. After traversing several hundred meters, the leading courier had just approached the edge of a large shell crater when a heavy machine gun exploded into action at point-blank range. Simultaneously, a flare sizzled skyward and burst, illuminating the area. Gefreiter Fleck had instinctively thrown himself prone at the instant the machine gun bullets cracked overhead. He stripped himself of the ration canisters and rolled into the shell crater to find the other 4 already in position, weapons trained over the edge, caps removed from the hand grenades. They immediately assumed that they had walked into an ambush and were prepared to give their lives only at great cost. In the brief silence that followed, they recognized hushed German voices whispering in the darkness from the direction of the machine gun position. One of the couriers shouted, "Don't shoot! It's your own people!" The machine gun remained silent. Within the crater, the men took a cursory count. Someone was missing. They called into the darkness for the Oberst and received no answer. Seconds later, the courier from the 2nd platoon located Keinsmiller's still form, lying 10 paces from the crater. The courier pulled the body upward by the shoulders and grasped the motionless officer around the chest. His hands came away sticky and warm. Immediately joining the courier, the others unbuttoned Oberst Keinsmiller's tunic and found a wound directly over the heart. The 19-year-old Gefreiter lifted his commander onto his shoulder and stumbled toward the MG position. The men of the MG crew from the neighbouring regiment could hardly imagine the catastrophe and were speechless with horror when it was revealed to them that their burst had killed their commander. The situation along the line in this sector was so precarious that all sentries had been forced to remain alert, fingers on their triggers in preparation for another attack. Just hours prior to this fatal mishap, an infiltrating Russian patrol had been repulsed at this very spot, and all noise and movement outside the line had to be considered enemy activity. This tragic incident had cost the regiment its most talented and respected leader. Oberst Keinsmiller had been with the men since the formation of the regiment in Lower Bavaria, throughout the Balkan campaign, and during the entire course of operations in Russia. His death was a heavy blow to the regiment, as well as to the division. 2 days later, he was laid to rest among his soldiers in the cemetery at Sogolubovka. It was said that the funeral was carried out with full military honours under the direction of the division and the Army Corps. This cemetery served as the grave site for the division through the 2 battles at Lake Ladoga, and the division medical centre had been established nearby. At the cemetery, a large birch cross was erected in the shadow of a well-preserved Greek Orthodox church. A few months later, the German army evacuated the area, and there remained no crosses to be seen on the graves of soldiers. To deny Soviet intelligence information regarding the formations involved in the vicinity, as well as to keep the names and numbers of the fallen from the enemy, military cemeteries were often stripped of any indications of burials and markers when an area was evacuated. Following the war, the Soviet government then made additional efforts to eradicate any remaining signs or monuments that the invaders might have erected to honour their dead. Those who fell on the vast expanses in the east now lie in lost graves. As the army continued in its attempts to satisfy the unrelenting appetite of the battlefields for military leaders, The Feldwebels and Obergefreiters began to play a more critical role in leading and commanding the combat forces. But the eternal old Gefreiters, many of whom became non-commissioned officers, constituted the backbone of the army. A common joke circulated that reflected the tone and disposition of the Lancers on the Russian front. It was supposed that when the victorious armies would eventually return from the east, a great parade would be held in Berlin. Marching columns would be observed by thousands of onlookers lining the Unter den Linden, and the magnificent ranks in all their finery would pass beneath the Brandenburg Gate. At the forefront would ride the generals and their staffs, resplendent in polished staff vehicles, with regimental banners flying. Following closely would come the unit commanders, accompanied by their staff officers, awards gleaming on their breasts, dress swords at their sides. Behind them roll the communications vans, the supply and logistics units, smartly riding in freshly painted Quebel wagons. Then come the field artillery batteries, heavy guns pulled by rumbling half-tracks and teams of groomed horses, all fittings polished and in perfect order. The entire procession would be led by Reichsmarschall Göring, outfitted in a resplendent white uniform piped with crimson and gold. Hanging at his throat is the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. His entire entourage would ride in half-tracked vehicles for effect. The parade passes by, the music eventually comes to an end, and the crowd, duly impressed, starts to disperse. Suddenly, trailing the magnificent parade at a distance, a ragged Lanzer, one of the eternal Gefreiters, wanders into view. His cracked and worn boots reflect the distance walked from the steppes of Russia. Wearing a tattered and faded uniform, augmented by bits and pieces of Russian military equipment, he sports a week's stubble of beard and is burdened with gas mask, entrenching tool, mess tin, shelter quarter, rifle and hand grenades. Battered and dented field badges pinned to his tunic indicate numerous engagements and multiple wounds suffered. As he approaches the Brandenburg Gate, he is stopped and asked to what extent he has contributed to the victory. He shakes his head, a look of bewilderment on his face, before responding, "Nix ponemayu." The single survivor from the decimated infantry regiments during the long years on the Eastern Front, he has forgotten the German language. Whenever the old Gefreiters were wounded, or more seldom disabled due to sickness, they would go to great lengths to avoid being sent to a replacement company, or to be reassigned as a replacement to another unit being newly formed. Through experience, they had learned that they were more likely to survive with their old unit, where everyone knew one another and knew those on whom they must depend with their lives. Individual units were composed of officers and NCO who had suffered deprivations and had experienced fear together for years on the front, and to be separated from these familiar surroundings and faces could be traumatic. With each loss of a battle-experienced member, the gap could often be filled only with personnel from supply, staff, or Luftwaffe units with little or no infantry combat experience. And as the numbers of the old veteran Gefreiters declined, the casualties among the new men would rise accordingly. On one occasion we received a group of replacements shortly after being relieved on the line. A Feldwebel escorted them to their new company, and as was customary I spoke with the new members, asking each individual his name, formal occupation, background, and so on. Among them were 4 soldiers from Alsace, and one of the short, stout Gefreiters looked vaguely familiar to me. It suddenly occurred to me that he had been the kitchen bull at the replacement centre, where I had received basic training as a recruit. I asked him if he had ever served with the Panzerjägerersatz Company in Darmstadt, and he replied with a hearty "Jawohl, Herr Leutnant." I then requested that he report to me later at the company headquarters. He appeared as ordered, completely outfitted with correct battle dress, including gas mask and helmet. I initially put him at ease with light conversation, and then I revealed to him that I had been a recruit under his direction in the past. He immediately sprang to attention with a look of distress on his face, as I related numerous incidents of harassment and verbal abuse that my friends and I had endured under his tutelage. I specifically mentioned one interesting incident during which he had discovered 2 tiny encrusted drops of coffee in the massive aluminum coffee canister I was engaged in cleaning, after which I was berated, insulted, and duly informed of the importance of cleanliness for the welfare of the army. I was then compelled to spend the remainder of the afternoon cleaning the kitchen equipment until each item met his satisfaction. To his immense relief, I then slapped him on the shoulder and remarked about the incredible trials one must endure to become a soldier. He proved to be a brave and very reliable member of the company. On the 22nd of July, the Russians attacked the Zappenkopf with overwhelming strength, and we were thrown into battle as regimental reserves to close a local breakthrough. During the course of the heavy fighting, a 20-year-old Alsatian received a severe wound, from which he subsequently died while being transported toward the regimental aid station. That evening his platoon, Feldwebel, gathered together the soldiers' effects. It was customary to separate those items to be sent to the relatives from those things that would not be appropriate for the family. During the course of these unpleasant duties, the Feldwebel approached me and requested to speak in confidence. He then revealed to me a letter written by the fallen soldier's mother. "Our dear son, you have now been sent to distant Russia as a German soldier. There will come a time for us in France when the sun shall shine again. We have heard that the Russians treat the Alsatians very well. The neighbour has told me that she wrote to her husband imploring him to surrender to the Russians. Throw away your rifle and go to the Russians. Surely they will treat you well." Other things followed, the common things that are written by distraught mothers to sons at war far from home. Leaving the letter in my care, the Feldwebel wordlessly departed. It was my duty to pass the letter to higher command. I failed to do so, although it was quite obvious that the writer neither trusted in nor desired a final victory for Germany. It was quite clear as well that the soldier's mother was willing to risk even her own life in an attempt to save her son from the fate that was befalling so many on the Eastern Front. I made a conscious decision not to bring additional hardship on the soldier's family. The fact that a grieving mother in Alsace did not support Germany's military endeavours or our political system would certainly have had no bearing on determining our victory or defeat in this world at war. In losing her son, she had already suffered more than a mother should have to bear. On the 28th of August, 1943, I celebrated my 23rd birthday on the operating table in the Field Medical Centre. I had recently been struck in the upper left arm by shrapnel from a shell fired by a Russian artillery battery south of Lake Ladoga. Despite cursory medical treatment, the wound had become infected, and it was suspected that fragments of my uniform had been carried into the wound by the jagged steel. After examining the wound, the regimental surgeon, Dr. Hager, ordered an operation, for which he used an anesthesia that supposedly put the patient into a trance, during which all questions asked would be truthfully answered. As I regained consciousness, I became aware that a large number of friends from the regiment, Fritz Schmidt, Bouquet, Deuschel, Rech and others, were gathered about to witness the effectiveness of the truth serum. Under the encouragement of Dr. Hager, they were very convincing when telling me of incredible things heard while I was under the influence of the medication. Not surprisingly, most of the questions asked were concerning certain experiences with females. In order to hinder the usual after-effects of the anesthesia, such as nausea and vomiting, a bottle of Kirschwasser was provided, with the understanding that it must be shared by all those present. The evening of drinking and song was broken only by the new jokes and rumours that now abounded at my expense concerning my supposed social life as revealed during the operation. Despite suffering subsequent pain and a fever from the wound, I remained among the troops until receiving orders for a furlough several days later. I soon departed for the homeland, accompanied by Dr. Hager and Hauptmann Dedel. At the end of our furlough, we met as planned in Lyuban, where we climbed aboard the train that carried us back to our regiment deep in Soviet Russia. The Volchov-Kirishi bridgehead. Those units of the 132D Infantry Division that were relieved to the west and south of Poriche were then sent into the Drachevo area to assume operations in the sector previously held by the 81st Infantry Division at the Volchov and Kirishi bridgehead. With the exception of occasional clashes between reconnaissance patrols from both sides, as well as isolated skirmishes along the perimeter of the bridgehead, the area assumed by the division on the 20th of August remained quiet. On the 27th of August, Oberst Altmann, commander of Grenadier Regiment 438, was killed while inspecting the forward lines of the Kirishi bridgehead. Without warning, an order was issued on the 11th of September to plan for the pending evacuation of the bridgehead by the 81st, the 132D, and units of the 96th Divisions. The positions in the area of Kusinka and south of Maya Grey were to be abandoned as well. On the 14th of September, preparations for the evacuation began. All excess material not immediately required for the fighting units was either transported or destroyed, including reserve ordnance and fuel. The transportation of the material was carried out over a period of 5 days, and upon completion of the final phases, all assets deemed of value to the enemy, such as bridges, roads, railways, dwellings, and wells, were prepared for destruction by the pioneer units. The sky filled with heavy black smoke as all supplies and equipment not removed were systematically destroyed by the Lancers as they prepared to withdraw. The evacuation and withdrawal plan for the combat units required 5 days to complete. For the purpose of hindering any follow-up action by the enemy, certain features were designated as strongpoints that were to be abandoned only during the last phase of the operation. Included in the strongpoints were areas within the Kirishi bridgehead and important railroad positions. The evacuation order was set into motion during the night of 2 October with the withdrawal of the 2nd Company, Grenadier Regiment 437, which had been designated the Bridgehead Reserve. Only one railway was available for the movement of an entire division, which now consisted primarily of horse-drawn artillery and dismounted infantry. However, the evacuation was flawlessly executed without interruption from enemy forces and with no losses in men and material. During the interim, the main line was held for another 24 hours until the Lancers quietly abandoned their thinly held positions at midnight. Soon after the last platoons had initiated their march out of the pocket, the enemy began cautiously probing the empty German positions with reconnaissance patrols and light infantry units. No large-scale enemy movement was detected, however, until the afternoon of the 5th of October, when enemy-tracked vehicles piled high with infantry were observed moving into the area of Irsa Dubrovo, and they were quickly taken under artillery fire. After the last battle-weary Lancers crossed the Volchov during the night of 2 the 3rd of October, preset demolitions charges were detonated, completely destroying the railroad bridge and rendering it unusable to the enemy. By midnight on the 5th of October, the division was occupying new positions at Kusinka and had completed defensive preparations. With the withdrawal of the last rear guard from Grenadier Regiment 437 and Fusilier Battalion 132 on the morning of the 6th of October, Operation Hubertusjagd came to an end. We received more propaganda leaflets from the Red Army that month. For the soldiers of the 7th Company, Infantry Regiment 437, 132 Infantry Division. German soldiers, Hitler has led you into a catastrophe. In attempts to conceal this fact, your High Command speaks of a flexible defence and a shortening of the front line. The Hitler clique has, in the course of 2 years on the Eastern Front, waged a war that has murdered millions of young Germans and made widows and orphans of millions more, only to gain a so-called shortening of the front line. You yourselves can judge the gains of the flexible defence, as the Red Army has already thrown the Germans behind the banks of the Dnieper, occupied the city of Zaporozhye, cut off the Crimea, and is now successfully fighting in the suburbs of Kiev and Gomel. The German army is bleeding to death on the Eastern Front. The fascist dictators have earlier said that you must sacrifice yourselves for the victorious end of the Blitzkrieg. Now they say you must fight to the last man for the flexible defence to succeed. You can easily recognise the lies of the fascists, but what price must you continue to pay? Here are a few facts from the tragic history of your company. 2. The 7th of November 1941. During the fighting before Bakhchisaray, in the Crimea, the company lost not less than 62 soldiers out of a strength of 180 men. The company again was reinforced, and after a short pause was thrown into the battle for Sevastopol. After this phase of fighting, only 16 men remained. In September 1942, the company was reorganized and its losses replaced on the Volchov front, and it was then engaged in the fighting at Gaitolovo on the MGA. After this battle, only 15 of 100 men remained, the 11th of October 1943. The 7th Company had already been withdrawn when it once again was hastily ordered to support the 12th Luftwaffe Field Division. Your commanders threw you into a counterattack that needlessly cost you heavy losses in defeat. The 7th Company was beaten back and left a third of its soldiers lying upon the battlefield.